there! So today let's talk about swatching in the round. Now, if you have gauge swatched in the past, you might be more familiar with a gauge that looks like this one. And this is a gauge swatch that was knit flat, which means that we knitted on either straight needles and we worked it back and forth. And for the majority right here, we knitted one way and purled back the other. And here is what a swatch in the round, and you might notice if you are familiar with swatching in the round, you might call me out for not cutting my float, but this is what a gauge swatch in the round looks like without having those cut floats. Before we dive in and how we do a gauge swatch in the round, I just want to explain why we want to do a gauge swatch in the round. So gauge is a really finicky thing. There are so many factors that can influence gauge, including the type of needle, whether it's wood or metal. If you're feeling a little extra stressed, your gauge might be a little tighter than normal. So there's so many things that can factor in. And another one of those things is if your project is worked in the round versus flat. So if you are working a pattern that is flat, then this gauge makes total sense. You know, if the majority of your pattern that you're working is knit back and forth, stockinette, where you knit one way, purl back another, this one is the one you want to do. But a majority of the pattern that you are working with is knit in the round, where you just knit, knit, knit on circular needles or double pointed needles, whatever it may be, then this is what you want. You want to have a gauge swatch in the round. And the reason why is because when we knit flat and we knit and then purl, basically the tension changes. The tension of our purl stitches is usually a little bit tighter than if we were to just go around and around and do stockinette. And it's great that I actually have this swatch here for both flat and in the round, because these were knit on the same exact needles. 4.5 millimeter needles. And you might even be able to physically just see that this swatch is a bit tighter than this one over here. And I measured it out, and this one, and even just in an inch increment, which typically you measure by 4 inches for your gauge swatch, but even in an inch increment, you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches per inch. And over here on our gauge swatch in the round, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches per inch. That's a huge difference over the course of a project. And if you were to go forward with your gauge from this gauge swatch, when you're going to actually be knitting in the round, your project is not going to be fitting very well. Now, I will point out that I knitted this gauge swatch on wooden needles, and usually wooden needles grip the yarn a little bit better. And this one was knitted on metal needles, so things slid a little bit more easily, which could have contributed to the looser gauge. And again, I just want to point out, that is how finicky gauge is. There are so many factors that go into it. All of that being said, I highly recommend that if you are knitting a project in the round, then your gauge swatch should be knit in the round as well. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we actually do our gauge swatch in the round. To get started, let's gather our materials. We're going to need our yarn, your yarn label, very important. You're going to also need your circular knitting needles. You'll also need a measuring tape and some scissors. And you're also going to be needing some water to block your swatch later on so we can get an accurate measurement in the end. So, first things first, how many stitches do we cast on? Now, in order to get an accurate gauge swatch, we ideally want our total gauge swatch to end up being about 6 inches wide and 6 inches tall. And the reason why that is because our tension might be a little funky at the top and at the sides. So we'll want to measure, to get the most accurate measurement, just the 4 inches in the middle, and 4 inches in the middle for the rows as well. So to give us that extra buffer room, we're really aiming for 6 inches or 15 centimeters. So to know how many stitches we need to cast on, let's take out that nifty yarn label. And your yarn label should tell you an estimate for what the gauge should be with this yarn using specific size knitting needles. So I am using Plain Air from Purl Soho, and this yarn label is telling me that using 3.75 to 4.5 millimeter needles, I will get 21 to 23 stitches per 4 inches. So then what we need to do is multiply the estimated stitch amount, which I'm going to go with the larger size that it says, or the larger number of stitches, the 23 stitches, just to give us some more stitches to play with, some more room to measure. And you're going to multiply that by 1.5. And why are we multiplying 1.5? Because 4 times 1.5 equals 6. Same for centimeters. 10 times 1.5 is 15 centimeters. So we also need to multiply that stitch estimate by 1.5 to know how many stitches we need to get roughly 6 inches. So I'm going to multiply 23 by 1.5. And that gives us 34.5 stitches. I'm going to round up to 35 stitches. So this is when we get our needles out. And to figure out how much yarn you need, I recommend just kind of running it up your arm and giving you a little extra, and that should be plenty of yarn to play with. And what we do to cast on is just any sort of cast on that you prefer. My go-to method is long tail cast on. So I'm just going to long tail cast on 35 stitches. So I have all of my stitches cast on. Now, this is where things get interesting. What you do, instead of just working, turning your work and working it, purling it back, what you do is you slide the stitches all the way to the other end of your circular needles. Push them on up. You take your other needle, and what I like to do to kind of help prevent the yarn getting tangled in your circular needle cord is bring it behind the working yarn, and that just kind of gets it a little bit out of the way. Then you just insert your needle, your right hand needle, knitwise, and knit it. I recommend keeping the stitch in place on the needle like so, because it's kind of locked in here. And what we're going to do is pull the working yarn to create a super long float. And ideally we want this float to be, if you want to measure, about 8 inches or so. So we want it wider than what we want the end result width of our gauge swatch to be. As you can see in this example here, that's what I have. The floats are wider than the swatch itself. So we really want a super long float, and the reason why is so it doesn't pull either end of the gauge swatch, especially if you plan on not cutting your floats. And I'll get to that in a minute. So I recommend, again, a super long float in the back. I just kind of eyeball it. Once you have your long float, you can take that first stitch off and you can work the rest of these stitches of this first round as normal. You might notice that this first stitch gets pretty loose. You can tighten it up, but we'll be tightening things up as we go along. So just keep knitting across that first round. And so I'm just finishing up that first knit round, and we're going to do the same thing we did for the cast on row that we did, where we are now at the end and we're just going to slide our stitches to the other end of our knitting needles. Adjust your needles as you need to make sure they're not going to get tangled up with your working yarn. And now with our stitches on the other end of our needles, we're going to take our knitting needle and go into that first stitch and bring our working yarn over and behind and knit that first stitch with the working yarn. Again, I like to keep my needle on that first stitch while I'm pulling the float, so it's kind of anchored here. And since we already have that super long float from the first time, we can kind of use that as a reference as we pull that second float. So I kind of just try to meet it where it's at. And then once it's all set, I slip that first stitch off and I continue to knit the rest of the round. After the first couple of stitches, I usually like to pause and tighten up by pulling on the floats. It tightens up the stitches, and that just helps to keep things a little bit neater as we go. So I'm going to continue knitting the rest of this round. All right, so I'm getting to the end of my second round, and we're just gonna rinse and repeat. So you might want to tighten up any ends over here by pulling on the floats, and then moving all of your stitches along to the other end of your needles. You might want to pull on some ends over here as well. Get your needles. Again, I like to go under the working yarn to just put it in the back so my cord doesn't get tangled. And we knit that first stitch, pull on the float, meet the other ones, slip that first stitch off, knit a couple of stitches, and then pull the float in the back to kind of tighten up any stitches on the edge, and keep going. Now, if you don't tighten up the ends as you go, it's not the end of the world, but it will make things a little bit easier for you. So let me just show you. So basically you just keep going. I recommend tightening up as you go. And the reason why is they're not gonna look perfect on the ends, but like even if you do tighten up, like I was tightening up the edges of this one, but you can see it's still kind of messy, and that's okay. The reason why we tighten up though is because if we don't, you'll kind of see like the last couple of columns, like the last 2 or 3 columns of the stitches will get really spaced out. It will kind of impede on the rest of our swatch a little bit and just give you less room to get an accurate measurement when you go to measure your swatch. So that's why I recommend tightening up as you go. If you don't, or if they still look messy, it's all okay, as long as you're able to get an accurate measurement at the end. So you just keep doing the same thing, keep going until your swatch measures 6 inches long. And at that point, you can just cast off using your regular cast off method. And as basically any cast off method will work as long as it doesn't like somehow disrupt the tension for the rest of your gauge swatch, which I don't think you'll be able to manage to do. So any cast off should be fine. So I'm gonna put this down for now, and I'm gonna again bring out this swatch. So imagine you have casted off your gauge swatch and it's looking something like this. When it's fresh off the needles, it's not quite ready to be measured yet. What you need to do is block your swatch first. So in order to do that, I recommend getting a bowl of water or going to your sink, getting your swatch, submerging it in the water, and what you really want to do is squeeze the swatch a little bit, get some air bubbles out, and let it soak for about 15 minutes. And then when you take it out, have a hand towel ready. This is really nifty. When you take it out, squeeze out excess water with your hands gently, and then have a hand towel ready, and you can just roll up your swatch gently. You know, you don't want to rub anything, but just gently roll it up, squeeze out excess water, and that will just help to allow your swatch to dry more quickly so we can actually start knitting more quickly, right? The reason why we block our swatch before we measure is because, especially if you are knitting a garment, you're going to end up washing that garment, and you don't want to be facing any surprises when you go to wash your garment and find that it drastically changes shape. So when we block our swatch, we're really mimicking what happens after you wash your finished piece, so we can get a very accurate idea of what our gauge is after it has been washed. So give it a good soaking and then lay it out to dry. I don't recommend pinning your swatch. Ideally, to get the most accurate measurement, you will probably want to cut these floats in the back just so you can lay it out super flat. However, I do not cut my floats on the back, and that's why I make them extra long, so that way it doesn't pull on anything. And the reason why I don't cut the floats on the back of my swatch is so I can reuse this yarn. I hate feeling I might run out of yarn, and I don't want this yarn to go to waste in case I do need it. To leave it to dry, I don't recommend pinning because you can kind of pin things aggressively and then you don't get a super accurate measurement. Instead, I recommend just kind of putting your hands in and like gently guiding it down to the table like that, so your floats are a little bit on the other side of it and just kind of like gently lay out the swatch in a way where the stitches look relaxed, not like overly stretched, but you just want them to kind of be. You want them to just be. So that way when you go to measure, they should be as accurate as possible. And when you do go to measure, again, you'll want to measure 4 inches or 10 centimeters in the middle of your swatch. And to get the most accurate measurement, I recommend measuring in a few different areas. So I would say the best, most accurate measurement would be in the middle here, but I also like to compare it to a measurement up here and down here, unlike the top third and the bottom third, and just kind of compare and see if there's any changes. If there's drastic differences between your gauge at the top versus the bottom or anywhere, then that might be a tension issue that you might need to look into a little bit. Maybe your knitting needles are causing you to have weird tension, or maybe you're just a beginner and figuring out how to knit, and you might want to redo your swatch because it's a good practice for getting your tension just right. I recommend measuring in a few different places. It should be relatively the same. If there's slight differences, you can take the average or go for the one that you find most often throughout your swatch. And same for rows, you'll want to do the same exact thing. So I would measure here, here, and here, and just kind of compare the measurements. And ideally, again, they should all be the same. And that's it. That is how you do your gauge swatch in the round. If you have any questions, please comment them below. And if you like this tutorial, please subscribe to my channel for more. And I also host fun knit-alongs and things like that, so I don't want you to miss out. All right, thank you and happy knitting.